This is Chapter 3, looking at the chemistry of life. So we are going to be looking at how all things are made up of matter, and atoms are the building blocks of that matter. So we'll take a look at atoms, how they come together to form molecules, and then we will look at water, which is one important molecule for life, and then we will look at the four biomolecules, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the lipids, and nucleic acids. So first off, we're going to start with matter. Matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. So you are matter, the computer is matter, the chair that you're sitting in is also matter. So all of those things, they have a mass, we can put them on a scale and weigh them in grams or kilograms, and they also have a volume, so they occupy space. This matter is made up of elements, and an element is a pure substance that has distinctive physical and chemical properties. And elements cannot be broken down using ordinary chemical means. Examples of elements include carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And those are the three main elements that make up living organisms. Elements are made up of small units called atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit of an element that retains the distinctive properties of that element. We can have an atom of carbon, and that will have all the properties of carbon. We can have an atom of oxygen that will have all the properties of oxygen. These atoms are made up of parts called subatomic particles. And in an atom has a nucleus, which is the middle of the atom. And this is made up of protons and neutrons. So in this image, we have a hydrogen atom and we also have a carbon atom. So we'll be looking at those two. In the nucleus, these atoms have protons. Those are the little positively charged orange circles. So they're found in the nucleus and they have a positive charge. In addition, atoms can have neutrons. Neutrons have a neutral charge, or they're uncharged, and they are also found in the nucleus. In this case, they are the white circles in the nucleus. Hydrogen has 1 proton and 0 neutrons. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. So we'll take a look at the protons and neutrons and what properties they give to these atoms. The third subatomic particle are the electrons. Electrons are found in shells or orbitals. Electrons have a negative charge to them, and they are found in these shells, so it looks like a little solar system. These electrons are those blue circles with the negative sign in them. These electron shells, the first shell can hold up to 2 electrons. The second shell or orbital can hold up to 8 electrons. Hydrogen atoms, they have 1 electron, so that 1 electron is in the first shell. Carbon atoms have 6 electrons. The first 2 electrons go into the first shell, and then that shell is full. The next 4 electrons go into the second shell. And those 4 electrons on the second shell that has the 4 open spots, remember we can have up to 8 electrons, that's what makes carbon really good for making bonds. And we'll come back to carbon and talk about it in a little bit. The number of protons in an atom is called the atomic number. And this number is unique to every element, so it does not change. So every atom of carbon has 6 protons in it. Every atom of oxygen has 8 protons in it. So every element has its own unique atomic number. Hydrogen has 1, carbon, like I mentioned, has 6, nitrogen 7, oxygen is 8. In addition to atomic number, the protons plus neutrons gives the atomic mass number. This is approximately how much an atom weighs. This is weighed in a unit called a Dalton. 1 proton equals 1 Dalton, 1 neutron equals 1 Dalton. So we can combine or add together the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, and that will give the mass of that atom. This number is also found on the periodic table down here, atomic mass number. Hydrogen has an atomic mass number of 1, and that is because it has 1 proton and 0 neutrons. Carbon has an atomic mass number of 12, so it has 6 protons, 6 neutrons. Add them together, you end up with 12. This mass number can change. So on periodic tables, carbon, it has a mass of 12.001. So we can have alternative forms of carbon atoms, and these are called isotopes. So an isotope is a form of an atom that has the same number of protons. So remember, the number of protons tells you what element you have. Carbon always has 6 protons, no matter what. That makes it carbon. Oxygen always has 8 protons, no matter what. That's what defines it as oxygen. But we can create isotopes that have a different number of neutrons. So if we add or subtract neutrons, that will influence the atomic mass number. So to give you an example, here we have carbon. And on average, the atomic mass of carbon is 12.001. So this 0.001, that is due to isotopes of carbon called carbon-13 or carbon-14. So normally about 99% of carbon is in a carbon-12 form, so it has 6 protons, 6 neutrons. 6 plus 6 equals 12. 1% of carbon is in the carbon-13 form. It still has 6 protons, but to make it a little bit heavier, to increase that mass, it has 7 neutrons. And 6 plus 7 is 13. Carbon-14, which is the least common isotope of carbon, it still has 6 protons because that's what makes it carbon, and it has 8 neutrons. 6 plus 8 gives you a mass of 14. So these different atoms of the different elements, they will then come and form molecules. So molecules are when we have atoms that are linked by different types of bonds. One type of bond that we're going to be looking at is a covalent bond. So over here we have a molecule of oxygen. Oxygen that we breathe is made up of 2 oxygen atoms that are bonded together. And these bonds occur with the electrons. Some molecules are compounds. So these are molecules that contain 2 or more atoms from 2 or more different elements. So a compound example would be water. Water is made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So this is a compound because it has different elements that are bonding together. Some of these compounds are organic. So any molecule or compound that contains at least 1 carbon-hydrogen bond is said to be organic, and organic refers to living things. And we'll look at 4 different types of organic molecules: the carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. There are different types of bonds that will hold our atoms together. The first one that was mentioned is a covalent bond. This is a bond that forms when 2 atoms share electrons with each other. So remember, those electrons are the part of the atom that creates bonds. Another type of bond is called an ionic bond. This forms when you have ions. So you'll have the charges of, you'll have a positive ion and a negative ion. Those positive and negative ions will attract each other, opposites attract, to create a molecule or compound. A good example of this is sodium chloride or table salt. So how sodium and chloride hold together is they use an ionic bond. So we have sodium that will lose an electron and become positive. Chlorine gains an electron, so it will have a negative charge to it. That positive sodium and negative chlorine attract each other and form an ionic bond. A third type of bond that we are going to see, especially when we get to water, is a hydrogen bond. This is a very weak electrical attraction between a molecule that has a partially positive hydrogen atom and a partially negative end. And this is called a polar molecule. We are going to be looking at water. Water is a polar molecule, and water is made up of one oxygen atom covalently bonded to two hydrogen atoms. In a water molecule, the oxygen side of water is partially negative. The other side of water has a partial positive charge to it. This is that polarity or polar molecule. So what happens is if you have a water molecule and then you put in a second water molecule, the negative oxygen end will be attracted to the positive hydrogen end. And this hydrogen bond is represented with a dotted line right here. So those are hydrogen bonds. They occur between molecules. Ionic bonds and covalent bonds, they occur to form molecules. Once we have all of these molecules created through these different types of bonds, these different molecules can go through chemical reactions. So a chemical reaction, this is a process where we break existing chemical bonds. Basically, we break up different molecules and compounds and create new molecules and compounds. In this example, we have photosynthesis, and we will look at photosynthesis in more detail later. But to give you an overall picture of what happens, we have reactants, which are the starting material. In this case, we have carbon dioxide and water. The carbon dioxide and the water, they go through a chemical reaction using sunlight energy to create glucose and oxygen, and those are our products. So if we look at this chemical reaction, we can see that this carbon dioxide, the carbons and oxygens right here, in order to make glucose, we take the hydrogens off the water, move them onto the carbon dioxide. So now we have glucose, which has carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens. This leaves oxygen all by itself to create oxygen. So we can see that we are breaking bonds in the water, taking those hydrogens and creating new bonds and adding it on to the carbon and oxygen right here. So it's all about breaking and making bonds. So we're going to go back to our water molecule. And water is a really important molecule for living things. So we're going to review this polarity that we find in water, and then we'll go through a few characteristics of water that make it important. So water is a polar molecule. So when the oxygen and two hydrogens bond with each other, they create a covalent bond. Covalent bonds are when atoms share electrons with each other. But sometimes those electrons are shared unequally, and this will lead to that polarity. So we end up with a water molecule. On the oxygen side, it has a partial negative charge because the electrons spend more time around the oxygen. On the other side, we end up with hydrogen atoms that have partial positive charges because electrons spend less time on the hydrogen side. And remember, electrons are negative, so if electrons spend more time in an area, it will make that area negative. If the electrons spend less time in an area, it will make it positive in charge. So because of this polarity and water forming hydrogen bonds, this will give water a lot of really important characteristics. So the polarity of water molecules and that hydrogen bonding explain nearly all of the properties of water that are important for living organisms. One property of water that's really important is that it is a universal solvent. So water is called a universal solvent because it can dissolve a lot of different substances in it. So think of salt water, or you can dissolve sugar in water if you make coffee. So being a universal solvent is really important because our cells can then dissolve things in that water and transport those molecules around within a cell or within our body. So we are able to transport salt, we're able to transport sugar, other electrolytes, so potassium, sodium, etc. So this water, this solvent, comes together with those solutes. So water's our solvent. We have sugar as an example of a solute to create a solution. So a solution is just a mixture when we have one or more solutes that are dissolved in a solvent. And in this case, our solvent is water because we're looking at living organisms. In chemistry, your solvent could be alcohol or another type of liquid, but we're really going to focus on water. When these solutes dissolve into the solvent to create a solution, sometimes this will change the pH of that solution. This is when we get to acids and bases. Acids and bases are chemical opposites of each other and they can neutralize each other. So if you mix an acid with a base, they will neutralize and give you a neutral pH. Acids are liquids that donate hydrogen ions to their surrounding, to their water. So these are liquids that have high hydrogen ion concentrations. Bases are the opposite. They will accept electrons or absorb hydrogen ions from their surrounding. So these are solutions that have low hydrogen ion concentration. We can measure the hydrogen ion concentration in our solutions, and when they're measured, we can place them onto a pH scale. So this pH scale represents the concentration of hydrogen ions, or the free concentration of hydrogen ions. And each pH unit represents a tenfold increase or decrease in hydrogen ions. So this is called a log scale. So if we look at the pH scale over here, in the middle we have a neutral pH, which is set at 7. And this is pure water. If we go below 7, these are acids. So these are substances that have high hydrogen ion concentration. So this is a little bit confusing. So we're going down in pH, but we're increasing the hydrogen ion concentration. So again, these are the acids, so tomatoes, oranges, lemons. If you go above 7, these are the bases. These are substances that have low hydrogen ion concentration. For example, we have seawater. So when we dissolve salt into water, that makes it basic. So we have a pH a little bit above 7, that neutral pH. And acids have a pH of 10.5. So if you think about it, when you have a very acidic stomach, you will take an antacid, and that will help to neutralize that stomach acid because acids and bases are opposite of each other. They're going to neutralize each other. These substances that dissolve in water are referred to as hydrophilic. Hydrophilic, if we break it down, hydro means water, philic means loving. So these are water-loving substances. They're substances that want to dissolve in water, and these molecules, they either have polar, covalent bonds, or ionic bonds. So this, for example, again, would be like salt. Salt dissolves in water. Or sugar. Sugar has polar, covalent bonds in it that allows it to dissolve in the water. So like I mentioned, water is a universal solvent. However, there are things that do not dissolve in water, and these are hydrophobic substances. Hydro again means water, phobic means fearing. So for example, if you have a phobia of spiders, you have an arachnophobia. So these water-fearing molecules do not dissolve in water. These are molecules that have nonpolar covalent bonds. Or what happens is that their electrons are shared equally. Good examples of hydrophobic molecules are olive oil. So any oils and fats do not dissolve in water, they are hydrophobic. Besides being a very good solvent, water is also found in 3 states of matter at temperatures in which living organisms can live. So water is found as a solid in the form of ice, as a liquid in the form of fluid water, and as a gas in the form of vapor or steam. These states of matter can go back and forth between each other. So we can have evaporation. This is when the state of matter changes from liquid to gas. And this requires heat. So we have to add in heat to heat up the water to create water vapor. To go in the opposite direction, in order to get that steam or water vapor back to the liquid form, it goes through condensation. And this requires cooling. In addition, water can go from ice to water through melting. We have to add heat. Water can also freeze, and we have to subtract heat. So water can go fairly easily from one state to another, either by adding heat or taking heat away from that water. So water is really important. It has a lot of good properties to it that allow living things to be living. Other molecules that we're going to look at are the organic molecules, or they're also referred to as the biomolecules. The 4 main types of biomolecules are proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. The proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, they are called polymers. So they are made up of repeating units of molecules called monomers. So one way to kind of think about this is that a monomer is a Lego block or a building block, and we put those monomers together to create the polymers. And mono is a prefix for one. Poly means many. So we take multiple monomers, hook them together to create a polymer, or many of those mers. So again, these are the proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. They're polymers. And I'll show you what those monomers are that we hook together. Lipids are not considered to be polymers because their structure is a little bit different. They do have building blocks we put together, but they're not repeating building blocks that we hook in a long chain. But I'll point out what they are made out of. So all 4 of these biomolecules are carbon-based, and carbon atoms can bond with up to 4 other atoms because of how their electrons are set up in their outer shell. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but if we come back, draw carbon here. Carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons and 6 electrons. So if we look at an atom of carbon, I just put in 6 protons and 6 neutrons. The 6 electrons, the first 2 electrons go in the first shell. It can hold up to 2. The next 4 electrons go into the second shell. This second shell can hold up to 8. So right now carbon has 4 electrons, and that means it will have 4 open spots where bonds can occur. So because of these 4 open spots, carbon really wants to fill up those open spots to get up to 8. So in order to do that, it can share electrons with other atoms like hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, to fill up those 4 empty spots. And it can have up to 4 bonds. So organic compounds are built off of carbon, and carbon again can make up to 4 bonds. So it can bond up to 4 hydrogens, or it can bond with oxygen or other carbon atoms. Atoms must fill up their outer shell to be stable, so carbon really wants to create those 4 bonds and share its 4 electrons so it can get a total of 8 electrons in that second shell. And this happens by covalent bonding, so they're going to share their 4 valence electrons with other atoms that will share their electrons, and you'll get up to 4 total electrons. So if we just look at methane right here as an example, we have carbon in the middle. The first 2 electrons go in the first shell, the next 4 go into the second shell. Hydrogen will share an additional electron in each of the 4 spots. So now we have a carbon bonded to 4 hydrogens, and we have 8 electrons in that outer shell. So now carbon is very happy. And you can take a look at the other molecules and see that when you add up those electrons, that outer shell has 8. The first molecule that we're going to be looking at are the proteins. Proteins are polymers that are made up of monomers called amino acids. So these are those building blocks. The protein function is very diverse. So proteins are the most numerous molecules that we have in our cells. They're also the most versatile of our 4 biomolecules. Proteins can be hundreds of amino acids long or thousands of amino acids long, and they will fold up into really neat 3D shapes. And that shape and size of the proteins influence what that protein does or their function. So some proteins give structure. Some proteins are enzymes. They help speed up reactions. Other proteins are used for storage. Some are used for membrane transport. They will transport molecules in and out of the cells. Some proteins are antibodies. They protect us. They're part of our immune system. Additional proteins are toxins, so they can cause harm. They can be used for, there's a lot of functions. Transport. The protein hemoglobin that is found in our red blood cells transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. Proteins are also pigments. They will give us our hair color, eye color, skin color. So proteins are basically molecules that have color to them. So there's a wide diversity of different functions. So they're very numerous, very versatile. So different combinations of those 20 amino acid monomers allow for these countless different types of proteins. So more examples: insulin, that helps us regulate our blood sugar. Hemoglobin, like I mentioned, that transports oxygen. And we get proteins from food that we eat. So these biomolecules also relate back to our diet or to our nutrition. So protein is really important. We have to eat enough protein because our bodies cannot create all of those amino acids from scratch. There are 9 essential amino acids that we have to get from our diet, and these come from leaner meats or fish. We can also get protein from cheese, eggs, any type of nuts like peanuts or beans. Our second molecule are the carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are the next most versatile molecule. And there are 3 types of carbohydrates. There are the monosaccharides, and this is also the monomer. Examples of monosaccharides are right here. There's fructose, glucose, and galactose. And these monosaccharides, it's just one carbon ring. If we take 2 of those monosaccharides and hook them together, it's called a disaccharide. So disaccharides that you may have heard of: lactose, which is milk sugar. Some individuals are lactose intolerant. That means that if you consume lactose, you are unable to break it down back into its 2 monomers. And due to that, unable to break it down, that will make you feel sick. Another important disaccharide over here is sucrose, and this is table sugar. So sugar that you use to dissolve in your coffee or that you use to make cake or cookies. The third type of carbohydrate are the polysaccharides or complex carbohydrates. Examples of these include starch, and starch is how plants store energy. Another example of a complex carbohydrate is glycogen, and that is how animals store energy. So we have a lot of glycogen in our liver and muscle cells, and that is the energy that we tap into first if you don't eat for a while. So if you're starting to get hungry, your stomach will signal to your brain that we need to release some glycogen, we need to break it down and get out some energy. So these carbohydrates, they also vary in size and shape and therefore function. So shape and structure helps to determine function. So a lot of the carbohydrates are used for short-term energy storage, like the glycogen that I just mentioned. So these carbohydrates, when you get hungry and you don't eat, your body will release the stored carbohydrates and it will break it down to make energy in the form of ATP. And we'll get into the details of how that works later. Another function of carbohydrates is structural support. So cellulose, otherwise known as fiber, is found in plants. It helps to give plants their structure to stand up against gravity. Chitin, which makes up the exoskeleton of bugs, right here. It's also found in mushrooms. It helps give them structure. And peptidoglycan, this is a structural carbohydrate found in our cartilage. So think of your ears are made up of cartilage. You can find peptidoglycan there. You can also find this in the cell wall of bacteria cells. Our third molecule are the nucleic acids, and this is the third and most crucial category of polymers. And there's 2 types of nucleic acids. There's DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. This is a polymer made up of deoxyribonucleotide monomers. And the function of DNA is it provides long-term, stable genetic information storage. So DNA is found in our cells, in the nucleus, and it stores all of our genetic information That genetic information is very stable and it can be easily copied and passed on to future generations. The second type of nucleic acid is the RNA, or the ribonucleic acid. This is a polymer of ribonucleotide monomers, and this provides a readable genetic language that enables us to create proteins. So to kind of put this into a flow chart, our DNA holds genetic information that is used to create RNA. The RNA is used to create proteins. And we will get into this process known as gene expression, or sometimes it's referred to as the central dogma of molecular biology. So our DNA goes through transcription to create RNA. RNA goes through translation to create our proteins. The fourth category of our biomolecules are the lipids. So these are also known as the fats, oils, and steroids. It's a diverse group. They're made up of hydrocarbons, fatty acids, there are glycerol molecules, and they also vary in size, shape, molecular components, and therefore their function. So there are three types of lipids. We have the triglycerides. These are composed of 3 fatty acid chains linked to a glycerol. And I'll point it out over here. So up here at the top, we have our triglyceride. We have a glycerol molecule, which is a 3-carbon molecule. To each of those carbons, we have these long chains. Those are the fatty acids. These triglycerides, they provide long-term energy storage. So these are the molecules that we tap into if you don't eat for a day or you don't eat for 2 days. They also provide insulation, so blubber, against animals that live in cold environments. Our second type of lipid are the phospholipids. These are composed of a phosphate group, which is this blue part. There is the glycerol, and instead of 3 fatty acids, it has 2 fatty acids attached. The neat thing about phospholipids is they're hydrophilic, so they are water-loving at this phosphate group end over here. The other end, the fatty acids, are hydrophobic, or they do not want to be around water. So these phospholipids, they're going to be the main component of cellular membranes. And we will take a little bit of a closer look at them when we get to cells. The third type are the steroids. And steroids, they have a different composition or molecular formula. They don't have fatty acids. They are composed of 4 carbon rings. They are also made out of cholesterol, and some of them are hormones. The 2 big ones are testosterone, which is found in higher levels in males, and estrogen, which is a hormone that we find at higher levels in females. So these are 2 lipids, the testosterone and estrogen, along with cholesterol. So those were our 4 biological molecules. So again, in this chapter, we focused on a little bit of chemistry. We have atoms that come together to create molecules. We looked at a few important molecules. We looked at the water. Then we looked at the carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and the lipids.